As we look at this passage, I think it's important to begin to know the background of this story. We're kind of coming into the middle of some action here. But I don't know how many of you know much about the First Corinthian congregation, but they were the charismaniacs of the day. If you read through your New Testament, there are a lot of churches and they all moved in the things of God. But this is a church that was flowing, more than any other congregation. Paul told them in another part of this book, you're not lacking any spiritual gift. Can you imagine that? They've got it all going. They're quaking and shaking, speaking in tongues, falling on the carpet, prophesying, preaching, flowing and going. I mean, this is like revival congregation here. I mean, they're just stirring and going. But one of the issues as they're coming into this here is there's been some kind of questions about Paul, some questions about his leadership. So Paul's going to begin to talk to them. In this particular little section we're reading, Paul is talking about himself. He's talking about who he is and what God's done in his life. But as I've read this passage, as I studied it, as I began to look into this story, I began to realize that while Paul's talking about himself, he's hoping that they're overhearing him. Because he's not really talking about himself, he's talking about them. So we're going to begin to delve into this here tonight and talking about being regarded, how we're regarded. Verse 1 here says this, so men ought to regard us as servants of Christ. Now what he's talking about here is not just himself, but the leaders and others. He says, you know what? This is how we ought to be regarded. This is the way, if everything was perfect, if everything was working the way it should, if we saw things how they should be, people would look and say, you know what? I consider you a servant of Christ. I consider you someone who lives for Jesus, one who works on his behalf. This language here in the Greek is speaking of like a servant, like one who would row the boat, one who would work in a household, one who would serve with great diligence and might. And Paul's saying here that we ought to be regarded this way. This is how we ought to be seen by other people, as someone, as a group of people who serve the Lord. But how are you perceived, friends? How does it look when people look in on you? How does it look when people look in on this church? How are we to be regarded? How are we to be seen? See, one of the difficulties as I begin to preach this and I talk about this here tonight is we're talking about how we're supposed to be regarded, how we're supposed to be seen, how we're supposed to operate, how we're supposed to move forward. But the problem is how we're supposed to do this and how we actually do it sometimes are two different things. And how we see things and how they're seen are two different things. How we understand our mission and purpose sometimes is different than how others are receiving us. See, one of the difficulties this congregation had in the Bible is that they were fiery and they were passionate and they were excited. But in some ways, they were missing God's ideal. In some ways, they weren't doing exactly what God wanted, even though he was moving mightily in their midst. Tonight, friends, how are we to be regarded? Let me tell you how we're to be regarded. We are to be regarded as faithful, as honorable, as gracious, as those who are like managers of a household. But it's important that that's the way we're seen. It's important that that's the way we're perceived. It's important that that's the way we operate because we have that calling. We have that trust. We have that placed in our hands. But that's how we're supposed to be seen. But the question I have here as we move forward is how do other people see us? How are we perceived in other ways? I know what you're supposed to be. I know what you're supposed to do. I know the calling that the Lord has put in our lives. I know the preciousness that stands upon us. But what are we doing with what we've been given? Paul continues to talk here, and he's hoping that they're listening to him. He's hoping that they're catching his example and his story because there's something he's trying to talk to them about. He says this here in the next verse. He says, I care very little if I am judged by you. See, he changes the talk about how he's being regarded. He says, first of all, how he's supposed to be regarded, but now he's talking about how other people regard him. Not just how he's supposed to be perceived, but how people are perceiving him. And he says, you know what? I don't know if I really care what you church folk think about me. And so we have a problem ourselves because sometimes as we move past how we're supposed to be seen, we start thinking about how other people see us. And we begin to be driven by the opinions and the perceptions of other people. There's some of you in here that are bothered or maybe shaped by what other people say, but a lot of you aren't. And as Paul's talking to the Corinthian church, their problem is not what other people think about them. That's not it. Tonight, as I'm looking here at World Revival and what we've been called to and how we're supposed to be regarded, I don't really believe that what other people are saying about us is the problem. It's something else. There's something else in terms of how we're regarded that affects us so much more. Something that, if we're not careful, can wreck us and move us in the wrong direction. Because it is an issue to hear what others have to say. It is an issue to hear how we're regarded by other voices. It affects us at times. It can inhibit us at times. But that's not the major issue. And as we're standing here in this room tonight, as we're listening to the Word of God, as we're pressing into our tomorrow, as we're believing for deeper things, it's not the voices of the outsiders that hinder us. Outsiders have never hindered revival as long as it's ever existed. Nobody who's outside a move of God has the power to shut down a move of God. Study revival history. Every time it was because the people who carried it began to squander what they had. The issue is not what is being said from without. The issue is not how others regard us that really puts a wrench in who we're supposed to be. The problem that we have as we're talking about how we should be regarded is not so much what other people say, but it's how you regard yourself. How you see yourself. How you perceive who you really are. How you have identified yourself. How you have understood yourself to be. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? The problem for the Corinthian church here is that they saw themselves as great revival people. They saw themselves as moving forth in power. They saw themselves as having glory and power in their midst, and they did. But the way they saw themselves was not completely the way they were. See, the problem is not so much how we're perceived by others for the most part. How others regard us is not going to be what's going to probably shut things down or cause difficulty or cause a breakdown. It's sometimes the misperceptions that we have about ourselves. We begin to lie to ourselves. We begin to justify ourselves to ourselves. We begin to see ourselves with limited view and limited perception. We begin to give ourselves more grace than others might. That's the problem with religion, friends. That's the problem with perception, because we don't care what other people say. We care a lot about what we say. We care a lot about how we perceive ourselves and the value that we place upon ourselves. And Paul says this, it's not so much that we need to be regarded by others because we don't need to listen to what they have to say. But you know what's more important? You know what the bigger issue, the bigger thing that's threatening who we're supposed to be is how we receive ourselves, how we regard who we are. The problem with the Corinthian congregation was they saw the move of God in the midst of them. They saw the giftings. They saw the power. They saw the good things that were upon them, but they didn't see the whole picture. They didn't see the fact that they were neglecting fellow members of this church. Paul had to write in 1 Corinthians 11, there are sick among you because you haven't discerned the body. You haven't perceived what's going on in the midst of the house of God here. And these people that struggled so much with love and relationship and connecting and valuing other people, out of desperation, he wrote a whole chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, trying to get them to peak, lift their head up and to perceive that there's a love problem in the midst of that body. But they didn't care because they were flowing and going. They didn't care because they had the fire of God. They didn't care because they spoke in tongues more than everybody else. They saw themselves as revivalists, as fireballs, as world changers. They saw themselves as something important. And Paul, he's trying to talk to them and says, now hold on a minute. It's not just that we can't look at what others say about us, but you know what? You can't look at how you see yourself. I can't look at how I see myself. What others see is wrong, but so is what we see. It's not something that we can do. We can't allow our own estimation of ourselves begin to shape who we are and how we're going and what we're going toward. The problem with this congregation in this Bible is that they're overhearing a man that tells them, you need to be careful how you regard yourself. You need to be careful in how you see who you really are. It's important that we don't allow ourselves to be regarded just by our own limited perceptions, by our own limited ways of seeing. I don't see the way I should. None of us see the way we should. We can't let ourselves be limited by our limited eyesight, by our limited perceptions. Because see, friends, tonight we can't be regarded by outsiders, but we can't be regarded by ourselves. That's not the issue. That's not the thing that's going to give us the future that we need. I want you to listen to this line. I've been hearing this line for days. I want you to hear it here. Right after he says that I don't judge myself, he says this here. He says in verse 4, my conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. That has just ruined me. I've been laying in my bed thinking about that. Do you understand what that means? That means, he says, you know what? I don't feel bad about who I am. I don't feel like I'm doing something wrong. I don't feel like I'm neglecting anything. I feel like what I'm doing is great. But just because your conscience isn't bothered doesn't mean you're innocent. Just because you feel like God's using you, just because you feel like there's power and might and a surge of glory, just because you can prophesy, just because you can sleep at night, doesn't mean you're innocent. Just because you have revival, just because you've got the glory, just because God's used you, doesn't mean you're innocent. If we neglect the deeper things of God, if we neglect the need to share this and to give this away and to pour into the lives of people far beyond us, then we are not innocent. If we can go home and never be burdened with anyone else, we are not innocent. And that's what's wrong with this Corinthian congregation. They separate the tables. They neglect the poor. They overlook everybody in this congregation. It's like a spiritual competition. Who can be the mightiest? Who can be the prayer warrior? Who can do this and who can do that? Who's spiritual and who isn't? They're like in a war and it's fighting with each other and contending with each other. Who can be the greatest revivalist in their midst? And Paul says, you know what? You don't care about the other people. You're not burdened with them. You're not in any way pricked to the heart about the need that's beyond you. You're satisfied with your spiritual, supernatural experiences. You're satisfied with a heightened mystical experience. But when it comes to loving people, you neglect it sorely. And you say, hey, Paul, my conscience is clear. You know, hey, I've evaluated my own life. I've evaluated the way I live, and I evaluate how I feel. I've got up off the floor here, and there's nothing wrong with me. You know, you're too hard. You're saying too much. You know what? You know, you regard me. I'm not going to listen to the way you regard me. See, the problem is they're listening to what they had to say about who they are. Sometimes I wonder, I've done it, friends. Sometimes we go home and we say, you know what, I feel like I'm doing pretty good. I've grown a little bit. I've put a few things away. I've gotten over some sin. I'm getting more generous in the offering. That's enough. My conscience is clear. There's peace in my heart. Everything's okay. People around me are dying and going to hell. People in my own church, their marriages are falling apart, and people can't find a friend in the body. That's okay, because me and my family, we're doing good. My conscience is clear because you know what? You know, I'm flowing in this. How could you say there's anything wrong with me? Well, friends, please hear me tonight. I'm not saying there is necessarily anything wrong with you. But my big point tonight is this. We can't allow ourselves to be regarded by others. But more importantly, we can't allow ourselves to be regarded by us. It's not what we say about ourselves that matters in the end. It's not how we perceive ourselves. It's not our own estimation of who we are that really matters. I would argue that it has very little weight at all. You say tonight, JD, well, what does matter? If the people out there don't matter, you know, the religion, the talk, the worldly people, if they don't matter, and if we don't matter, well, who does matter? The answer is very simple. Next phrase here, it says, it is the Lord who judges me. Tonight, friends, I'm not trying to place any judgment myself. I have no right to stand before you and regard you in any real way. You know, who am I to pass judgment on this body? Who am I to make any kind of declaration? But I'm saying this, not only do we need to overlook what the outsiders might say, not only do we need to overlook what we might say about who we are, but we've got to come down to the reality. Here is how we're to be regarded. We're to be regarded by the Lord. It's what God says about us that matters. It's what God declares us to be that matters. Tonight, as I'm bringing this message to a close, I want to share this with you. I just want you to know that we cannot allow ourselves to be shaped by anything but by what God says about us. The Corinthian church neglected the body. They neglected others. They had no concern for anyone besides themselves. And God was not pleased with that. But they were pleased with themselves. And I got to ask you tonight, I don't know, what would God say about us in this body here? We're not neglecting any spiritual gift. We're not neglecting any breakthrough. God moves in power. He moves in finances. He moves in all these marvelous ways. But I'm looking at the home crowd tonight on a Saturday night, and I'm asking you, what would God say about us in our heart? What would He say about our love? What would He say about our concern? What would He say about our burden for those who are not in this room tonight? How would God regard us? What would He see us as being and doing? That's the question. I can't pass judgment on that. I have no right to make that final determination. But the question is not, what does JD have to say tonight? The question is, what does God have to say? What would God say about who we are? What would He say as He looks down upon us in the way we live? I know, you say you're innocent. I know you say, hey, I'm doing the best I can, JD. You know, I don't have a lot of time, and you know, I got kids, and my work's hard, and we don't have much money. But what would God, are you really innocent? Do you have a justification? Just because you're okay with who you are. does not mean that God is. And if we're going to find our future, friends, if we're going to move into our tomorrow, we're going to have to really overhear what Paul had to say to this church and realize again that Paul wasn't just talking about himself. He wasn't just saying, I'm going to let myself be judged by God. He was hoping that this Corinthian church would listen to what he was saying. And you know what else? As time has passed and the years go on, the Holy Spirit tonight hopes that you're overhearing Paul too. What would God say about you? How would God regard you tonight? Are we to regard as one who is faithful, who's a good steward of the things that God has given us? Or are we people that just do what we want and live as we live and enjoy the experiences, enjoy the moments? When it's all said and done, as long as we're okay with ourselves, that's all that matters. As long as we can live with ourselves, as long as we can live with our own sin, then we're okay. Too often, if we're not bothered by something, we don't deal with it. If we're not concerned about something, we make no effort to change. You know, I think that famous saying is that the only time we're willing to change is when the pain of keeping things the same is greater than doing something new. Tonight, I'm not asking you whether you can live with yourself. I'm trying to ask you whether God's pleased with you. I don't know the answer to that question. I really don't know the answer. But I'm asking you tonight to settle that issue, to come to grips with the fact that God has entrusted this body with something more. I believe it. You know, and I want to say this. I believe that we could do so much more in touching the lives of others. How could we have a great revival in this body and not want to share it with other people? How could we have the glory of God in our lives and not want to see that imparted into the lives of people that we meet and the people that we know? How could we not want to see more and more people brought into this? How could we not? What would happen in this next year to come if suddenly we begin to take this trust seriously, if we begin to grab hold of what God is saying, if we really get a mindset to begin to pour ourselves out, what would happen? Where would we go and who would we be? Friends, tonight I'm just asking you. I'm asking you, how does God regard you? What's he say? Not what do the other people say. I'm not even asking you what Randy Lohman or Pastor Mark say about you. I'm asking you, what does God have to say about you? Tonight, that's the one that really matters. I'm pleading with you, if you feel like God doesn't have anything good to say, tonight is the night to do something about that. Tonight is the night to see a heart change. Tonight is the night to see us move into the future that God has called us to be.